During the past few weeks, several of you have been wondering when we would get to Constantine, when to Orthodoxy. The moment has come. We will consider the ways in which, during the 4th century of the Common Era, Christianity emerged as the official religion of the Roman Empire and made specific doctrinal claims through its creeds, which it held it was necessary to believe in order for a person to win salvation. The position of the religion in the earlier period was not at all that it could command that sort of ground. So we're going to consider today what happened during the 4th century in order to bring that major change about, and at least to begin to consider the implications of that change. I'm happy to see that we have a good proportion of us here today, that were here last week, despite the interest of the weather. I think those who were not here were probably sledding. For those who needed to get out there and slide, I have also provided on one side of this sheet the handout for last week, Ethics, Canon, and Philosophy. That will give you a sense of the ground that we covered, but I can't go back over that ground today. If you'd like to, though, the Cardinal of Red Hook will tell you how to order the lecture. I am, however, going to refer you to the point of last week's lecture, which appears at the very bottom of that same handout. When Origen speaks of Christ as being what he calls in Greek the Logos, that is, the Word of God. This term Logos comes to Origen from two sources. One source, of course, is the Bible, the Scriptures of Israel, that speak of God giving His Word to the prophets, who in turn are able to interpret God's will and purpose to His people. So there's a tight connection between God's Word and God's thought within the Hebrew Scriptures. That's one source that Origen, during the 3rd century, is drawing on. And the other source is the way in which the term Logos is used within the Roman Empire, to speak of how it is that there is a single organizing purpose, we might say a logic, that governs the universe, that governs the natural world, and that also is implicit within a rightly ordered society. One reason that the term Logos, word, acquired the kind of traction that it did within this period of early Christian mission is that it drew on both the sources of the Hebrew Bible and of Hellenistic philosophy. For Origen, Jesus is the Logos because he always is the image of God. He's not only the image of God when he is in his historical life, he has always been the image of God. He is a very part of God's nature. And for that reason, Origen can write, concerning the saints who lived before the corporeal coming of Jesus, and who had something more than the other faithful, so that they comprehended the mysteries of divinity, it was the Logos who taught them before he became flesh. What emerges during this period, as the 3rd century comes to an end, is a picture of Christianity as offering insight into God as God always has been. They do not limit their understanding of Jesus to the time of his historical life. They rather see the historical life as being an illustration of an eternal principle. This insistence upon God's eternity and how God has always been available to people is an example of the way in which Platonism affected the thought of the early church. Plato had influenced some of the thinkers as early as the 2nd century, but by the time we come to the 3rd century and Origen, we have come to the moment where basically Plato is the understanding that Christian thinkers reflexively use as they try to articulate the faith. That is the key, if you want to flip the page, to what was going on at the time that Orthodox Catholicism emerged. It happens, of course, with this fateful battle that Constantine fought at the Milvian Bridge. At the Milvian Bridge in 311 of the Common Era, Constantine decided to permit his soldiers, as they were going out to battle, to include Christian images among their insignia. There are various later legends about why Constantine did that. I'm not going to concern myself with those legends. Simply with the fact that Constantine gave his permission to troops to go into battle with the sign of the cross. That, to me, is actually far more startling than any story about how Constantine had a vision, which, as I say, comes from a later period. What is startling to me is that soldiers are wishing to incorporate Christian symbols on their shields. Why should they be doing that? After all, they're not in any position to prepare themselves for baptism. Christian teaching during this period refuses to accept soldiers for baptism, refuses to accept teachers for baptism. Why? Because teachers have to impose sacrifice to Greco-Roman gods as part of their work in the classroom. There are a whole range of professions which are excluded from baptism in this period, and yet some of those in an excluded profession want to bear Christian symbols. Why should that be the case? That's an indication of the way in which this Platonic understanding of Christianity had made its way. One could come to an understanding of Christianity, and by that understanding itself, without baptism, come nearer to God than was possible otherwise. And so you had a growing popular use of Christian symbols even among those who had not been baptized. Incidentally, during this period, the number of the baptized themselves in the entire Greco-Roman world has been estimated still as less than 10% of the overall population. But what the Battle of Milvian Bridge is showing us is that there was a segment of the population strongly sympathetic with the Christian conception of God being available in this world by means of symbol, so that through those signs one could have access to divinity. Constantine, of course, won the battle, and he also, with his co-emperor, at first he had a co-emperor whose name was Licinius, whom we quickly forget because it didn't last too long. With Licinius, he issued an edict of toleration. The toleration was not only for Christians, but also for Manichaeans, who had also been persecuted in the earlier decades by the Roman emperor. That toleration, however, over the course of time, turned into something quite different. And it happened rapidly. One of those who saw the implications of what was going on is the first historian of the church, whose name was Eusebius. He was a bishop of the time, he was a confidant of Constantine's, and was personally witness to many of the events that he refers to. But he's more important actually as a commentator than he is as a witness, because the way he understands what was going on in his own period has influenced Christian thinking and indeed political thinking ever since the time of Eusebius. When trying to put into words why it should be that there was a great change, a pivot in historical experience, Eusebius expresses this in the Platonist terms that he had learned, because he also was a student of the writings of Origen. For him, a change of political circumstance on the earth, as dramatic as the toleration of Christianity, must be the symptom of a change in heaven. And so you have an example in the first quotation of a Christian thinking through in Platonic terms what it means for the emperor to say one may legally be a Christian. But once again, he writes, the angel of the great council, referring to Christ, God's great commander-in-chief, after the thoroughgoing training of which the greatest soldiers in his kingdom gave proof of their patience and endurance in all trials, appeared suddenly and thereby swept all that was hostile and inimical into oblivion and nothingness, so that its very existence was forgotten. But all that was near and dear to him, he advanced beyond glory in the sight of all, not only men, but the heavenly powers as well, sun, moon, stars, and the entire heaven and earth. As far as Eusebius was concerned, humanity was now living in a new epoch, an epoch in which government itself is coming to be a reflection of the kingdom of heaven. It had been the most important hostile force. Now it was seen as being a support. As a result of that, Eusebius also gives us the Christian theory of what came to be known as the divine right of kings, when he refers to the person of Constantine. You can see that in the second excerpt from his writing called Praise of Constantine, our emperor, beloved of God, bearing a kind of image of the supreme rule, as it were in imitation of the greater, directs the course of all things upon earth. The conception emerges that just as Christ is at the very center of power in heaven, so the emperor bears the image of Christ and imitates his glory on the earth. It amounts to a kind of baptism of the concept of political power on the grounds that what had been the principal enemy has now been a principal supporter. To some extent, the enthusiasm of Eusebius becomes more understandable when you consider the way in which Constantine put first tolerance and later on preference of Christianity into action. At first, it meant that as a Christian, you could be a school teacher. You could join the army, because now the Roman Empire was not going to require sacrifice to the gods of Rome. It also meant that Constantine felt that really Christians should have a better place to accommodate them. There should be buildings of worship that are suitable to their numbers. And therefore, he actually handed over the equivalent of town halls for the purpose of Christian worship. This is what results in the structure known as the basilica. A basilica is so named not because Christians invented it, they did not. A basilica is so named because it belongs to a king, a basileus in Greek. So a basilican structure is literally a royal structure. The reason basilicas were built was that they were intended to be large, rectangular halls with good acoustics where people could hear, and therefore they often also developed columns inside so that they could get the extent possible to bring in large numbers of people to debate, to hear official decrees read, and that kind of operation. Constantine says Christians can have that. Oh, and by the way, Christian clergy, you're judges. You're going to be able to marry people now. By the way, a Constantinian right that clergy still have. Thomas Jefferson didn't invent this. It comes from Constantine, from his thought that if we're going to recognize Christianity as legal, we can use it also as a method of our rule. But now there comes a question. Which Christianity is it that we are recognizing? Because even in this early period, there were varying kinds of faith, enormous controversy over how it is that we should understand our relationship to the Torah, as we've discussed, our sense of the degree to which we can accommodate to the Greco-Roman world, how much we feel that a philosophical understanding of Christianity is necessary. And in particular, there were an entire range of groups of whom I've spoken in the past, called the Gnostics, who had set up a parallel structure to what was going on within the generality of Christianity. Gnostics tended not to use the combination of the scriptures of Israel with the New Testament as their holy writing. Rather, they focused on what they considered to be revelations to their particular teachers. So many of you may have heard of the Gospel according to Thomas, or more recently, the Gospel of Judas. Those are examples of 2nd and 3rd century Gnostic writings in which it was claimed these figures from the past have appeared to Gnostic teachers and are now showing them the way in which those who wish to follow Jesus should walk. Each of those Gnostic groups had its own particular character. Does Constantine wish to recognize one of them? Does he wish to define Christianity more broadly? In which case, how is he going to do that? Constantine made a wise decision. He came to the conclusion, I don't know. I understand that I want to tolerate Christianity. I'm also quite clear that it's possible to use its goodwill and its clergy to help with the administration of the empire, but because I don't know, I'll call a council. I will ask bishops from around the Mediterranean world, which from his point of view was the world, to come to a place near the center of my power. During this time, Constantine had seen, as a strategist, that the city of Rome was no longer the center of power, and that for both economic and military reasons, he had better move east. So we moved to Byzantium, which later we called Constantinople, and today Istanbul. He built there what he called New Rome, with a magnificent cathedral. So now, in effect, Asia Minor, present-day Turkey, had become the center, the focus of Roman power. So he wants to choose a place where bishops can go away from the city and consult as to what exactly makes the church the church. That's why he sent them to Nicaea. And off to the city called Nicaea came bishops, especially bishops from Asia Minor, because they were right there, but also from the Middle East, from North Africa, and further abroad. The Bishop of Rome did not come. I don't know, he was busy, it was a long trip, he didn't actually arrive, but other what were called metropolitan bishops, that is, bishops of cities, came along to Nicaea. And it was they who gave us the creed named after the city, the Nicene Creed, of which I give you an excerpt. But the reason for the excerpt is not to remind you of how to whistle Dixie. If you need to do that, you have prayer books in front of you. The purpose of the excerpt is to concentrate on the two principal questions that the bishops of Nicaea wanted to conclude on the basis of the creed. The one is the range of God's creation. Some of you may remember from our discussion of Gnosticism earlier that there were many Gnostic teachers who held the world that you see is a false world, and the God who produced this world a false God. Many of them also maintained that Yahweh, as revealed in the Hebrew Bible, is a pretender, a counterfeit God. At Nicaea, the bishops decided that they should articulate what they had come to think of as being the Catholic faith. That is, the faith not held in one particular part of Christianity, not in one place, not in one time, not on the basis of one or two writings, but Christianity, as they would say in Greek, katholes, through the whole. Katholike. That's exactly what Catholic Christianity in its original meaning refers to. It's not localized in the Vatican. There was no Vatican. Bishop of Rome wasn't there. It took him a while to figure out this was important. He came to the second meeting. It is to say that within our understanding of Catholic Christianity, God is God not only of what we can see, but also of what we cannot see. So that even if we had a theory according to which this visible world grew out of an earlier world and an earlier world, at the source, there would still be God. Now, in that assertion, Catholic Christianity was committing itself to address a particular issue. Because the whole point of the Gnostic claim that the God of this world is not true God was to try to say that the true God is not responsible for suffering. If you say God is truly behind this world, even as it is lived, you have to pose the question, what about the existence of suffering? How do you go about addressing that and the existence of evil? At Nicaea, that commitment was taken up, along with another commitment which went alongside the first. And that had to do, this is the more famous part of the creed, with the understanding of Jesus as being, as the creed says, of one substance with the Father. That is saying that everything that is true about the existence of God as being maker is also true about the existence of God as being redeemer. That intent to redeem the world was part of God from all creation. a later thinker who influenced the Nicene Creed, the Bishop of Alexandria, whose name was Athanasius, was able to put this very succinctly by saying, there was not a time when the sun was not. Not a time when the sun was not. Therefore, you can't think of a time before the Logos. You can't think of a time after the Logos. Because the Logos, being the very thought of God, is God. And that is the move of Orthodox Catholicism. It is to say, we can understand why Jesus is like God by the simple insight that Jesus is truly God. And because we accept that, we understand how it is that creation itself came about, and also how it is that we can be inspired by God, because Spirit is also an aspect of the divine personality. Now, as these moves were made at Nicaea, there was also a resolution that emerged during the course of the 4th century over the question of what exactly should go into the canon of the New Testament. I referred last week to the development of the canon just about exactly as we would know it, but not quite exactly. During the course of the 4th century, 2 works which had long been controversial finally found their way into the canon. Each of these, in their differing ways, show us how exactly it is that the bishops of Nicaea saw their orthodoxy. The first of these works is called the Epistle to the Hebrews. It appears in the New Testament. It has the look of a letter of Paul when you read it very quickly, and then when you read it in a little more settled fashion, you see, no, it's actually not Paul. Origen put it best. He said, who wrote this letter? God knows who wrote this letter. It is effectively a pseudonymous work, and everyone knew it was such. But at Nicaea, it was included in the canon for one simple reason. Of all the works in the New Testament, Hebrews is the one which is most Platonic, that represents Jesus as being the Son of God eternally, and sees him as being the heavenly archetype on which worship in the old temple in Jerusalem had been based. So that when that temple was destroyed, the argument of Hebrews is, that was only to highlight what the actual purpose of worship in the temple had been, namely the sacrifice of the Son of God. So Hebrews represents the Platonism of the Fathers at Nicaea precisely. The other work that's included is the last book in the New Testament, the Revelation of John. And this is because thinkers such as Eusebius, when they looked at the nearly apocalyptic event of the emperor's conversion, took away the nearly. Eusebius said, this is the pivot of all human existence. We have now entered into the millennium of the saints. We are now in a completely new age, the last phase of human history, which is to be seen out by this now Christianized empire, the like of which no one had ever predicted, and which must see us through to the climax of all history. That perspective helps you to see why it is that by the close of the century, even as the Creed of Nicaea was being finalized at Constantinople, another emperor, Theodosius, issued an edict. And you can see that edict is the last entry on today's sheet. I'll skip down to the bottom of the edict. According to the apostolic teaching and the doctrine of the gospel, let us believe the one deity of the Father, the Son, and Holy Spirit in equal majesty and in a holy Trinity. We authorize the followers of this law to assume the title of Catholic Christians. But as for others, since in our judgment they are foolish madmen, we decree that they shall be branded with the ignominious name of heretics, and shall not presume to give their conventicles the name of churches. There's no question but that by 380, when this edict was issued, the church is the established official religion of the Roman Empire, and that there are consequences for those who refuse to adhere to its doctrine. What's emerged by this time has been a shift in what I've referred to earlier as that three-part system of ritual, meaning, and ethics. Now, under the aspect of meaning, instead of the earlier emphasis upon the fatherhood of God, we have the orthodoxy of creeds, the necessity of believing these doctrines and precisely these doctrines in order to be a member of the church. Alongside with that, ritual has been expanded. Yes, there is baptism, there is Eucharist, but that is by no means the end. If you look at the manuals of ritual from this period, you can see an enormous addition of new kinds of practice within Orthodox Christianity. And finally, there's a new emphasis on ethics in a new category. It is no longer simply following Christ, but making atonement for the evil that there is in this world. Do you see how this related to the Creed? The Creed had asserted that the God behind this world is fundamentally good. So the issue then arises, inevitably, what are we to make of suffering and evil? The answer comes back ethically, for that you need atonement. Atonement of what kind? How should we act? In order to understand that, we need to pursue our discussion next week. Thank you very much indeed. Yes, please, Al.
I want to ask about the popular will. How many tea parties did the bishop have to deal with? And I suspect that the bishops were really representing a popular will. And that's my question.
Mm-hmm. The question has to do with popular will. Were the bishops at Nicaea and elsewhere representing what we would call popular will? And I think the evidence has to be anecdotal, but the evidence is overwhelmingly positive that they were representing popular will. One of the bishops in a particularly fraught time was describing being in the city when the issue is, how should we understand Christ in relation to God the Father? Should we say homoousios, of one being, or should we say homoiousios, of like being? It's exactly one letter difference in Greek. And he described being shaved by a barber, and the barber saying to him, "Which do you think it is?" He understood the popular will. Another example of this actually comes from the next century, but I can show you what I mean by popular by giving you this example. In Constantinople itself, a bishop who was a brilliant theologian, saw that people in the cathedral in Constantinople, in their veneration for Mary as being the Mother of God, were tipping over from veneration into worship of a separate deity. He believed that their activity not only bordered on superstition, but that it had become superstitious. And as a result of that, he ordered the removal of some shrines to Mary. The result was literally a riot. These are called the Theotokos riots, because when you acknowledge Mary as Mother of God, you call her Theotokos, God-bearer. And that popular uprising was so great that it overturned the rule of that particular bishop. He was replaced, and in the way of these things, exiled to boot. He didn't get to move into an apartment in the cathedral, didn't get to wear his red shoes. He was out. And in addition to that, Mary as Theotokos came to be read increasingly into ecumenical statements. Oh, I should explain something else. When I say ecumenical in these terms, I mean that in the way it was used originally. You know, today we say ecumenical to mean Al and I can eat together, although he's a Lutheran. And I'm a member of the true church. We can eat together. And believe it or not, we recently said we could even celebrate communion together. Oh, wow, what a relief that is. We are presently talking in the same terms with the Methodists, but that's not going to happen. So we have all that going on. That's what we mean by ecumenical now. The original term derives from the Greek ekumene, which means over the whole inhabited world. So if you say we're having an ecumenical council at Nicaea, that means everyone can be represented. If you've got a bishop, send a bishop. If he's too lazy to come, let him stay in Rome, but those who want to come can come. That's what ecumenical meant at the time, and this is what Constantine was after, because he wanted to be able to say, whatever happened at the outcome, whatever the words used were, he wanted to be able to say, this is what we agreed the Catholic faith is. Because if we can agree that, then I, as emperor, can say what the church is. I know who to subsidize, I know who to approve. Later on, in the case of his successor, Theodosius would know who to persecute on this basis. But the aim was a rational official policy. From a political point of view, it was just a matter of governing in an effective manner. From the theological point of view, seen through the lens of Eusebius, this was the turning point of the ages. Yes, please. Bob.
You spoke of the agreement that God was good. What about the concept of God as perfect? Is that taken up, or is that?
Yeah, this is a very wise question. What is the understanding of God as good in relation to God as being perfect? To say that God is good is to acknowledge the inherent goodness of creation itself and to point to God as being its source. In this regard, theologians of the period never forgot that the term Abba in Aramaic, although it definitely means father, also means source. So, from the tree comes the fruit. Good tree, good result. Our world should be seen as good, as coming from the goodness of God. But then can we take another step beyond goodness towards the perfection of God? And the answer to that in the 4th century is we definitely can. Because in a Platonic understanding of anything that is good, That goodness is only possible because there is an ideal of that good. That's what the perfect is. You can never see the perfect. There's no such thing as a perfect man, as any woman can tell you. Nothing on earth represents that perfection. But in order for us to have a conception of what good is, there must be perfection somewhere. That becomes the standard by which it's possible for us to perceive what is good. That's the Platonic move that Christianity is committed to during the whole of this period. So that whatever the ultimate ideal standard is perfect. So that refers to God in heaven. As God's effects work out on the earth, that is good. But in the good, there is always and inevitably involved the imperfect, which requires atonement, that ethical component within the new Orthodox Catholic system. And that conception of atonement, we'll see when we discuss it next week, brings us into characteristic emphases on penance, on martyrdom, and on ascetical practice that became characteristic of Christianity exactly during this period. Yes, please.
I noticed that in the teachings of Jesus you have an interpersonal ethic based on love that is somehow lost sometimes in institutional forms, particularly in the branding of heretics.
Mm-hmm.
And one would have liked to have seen perhaps a more charitable edict from Rome concerning the treatment of those who misunderstand the faith.
Mm-hmm.
And I understand that this very same thing happens today. So I think that it's a big disappointment to me that institutional forms seem to have lost sight of the ethic of interpersonal responsibility that Jesus created.
Mm-hmm. This is a very good comment. It has to do with the way in which heretics are treated, as you say. It's actually during this period, in the 4th century, that heresy, as we understand it, is born. What do I mean by that? It's not that these deviant opinions were born. I mean, people have disagreed forever. It's rather that the very concept of heresy is born. The word in Greek, heresis, actually doesn't mean heresy. The word heresis simply refers to a school of thought. That is, if you had a particular philosophy, if you were a Stoic, that would be a heresis. A Platonist, an Epicurean, whatever your particular point of view might be. So that during the 2nd century, when Irenaeus, who we discussed last week, referred to different hereses, what he meant was different schools of thought. And he was not in any position to say, those people are heretics, because everybody's a heretic. Everyone's being persecuted by the Romans. The issue was, what's true knowledge, as you can see from the title of his work. His work is, today, in the modern period, commonly referred to as Against Heresies. That's wrong. He gave it his own title. What's wrong with his title? His title is Refutation of False Knowledge. You see the Gnostic issue arising there already. But he treats of the question of a heresis as being, there's this school of thought and that school of thought, and then there's what I'm going to tell you, which is the truth. I mean, that's what everyone says. I mean, why would you argue for something you didn't believe was the truth? But by the 4th century, by the time of this Edict of Thessalonica that Theodosius issued, the term heresis is being used in a different way. And the reason that's possible is that orthodoxy has emerged as a standard. And with that emergence comes the thought that if you depart from that standard, it must be that your school of thought is leading you to wander into untruth. Now I call someone a heretic in the current sense, which has been current since the 4th century. Furthermore, it's used not only for Christians who believe differently, but for Jews as a whole, and also for those who belong to pagan philosophies, which earlier had actually been approved. So I think the burden of what you're saying is an important insight, that one consequence of the idea of orthodoxy in itself was the notion of deviation from orthodoxy. So now heresy is seen not simply as incorrect opinion, but literally as deviant opinion. If you want to say that's disappointing, I can only agree. And to see within it one way in which adapting to an institutional application of Christianity results in a loss of values which are clearly present in the gospel. This is, however, not a tragedy which is exactly unique to Christianity. That is, the very attempt to apply at, as it were, industrial scale, the teachings of someone who has a limited number of followers often results in extraordinary distortions. I've just been reading some of the history of Marxism with my students, and I've been brought face to face with this reality several times. Yes, please.
Did Buddhism have any, and the Buddhist Dharma have any recognized influence on the early shaping of Christianity?
I would question was whether Buddhist teaching had any influence on the early shaping of Christianity. There's no doubt that there was contact with India during the period when the New Testament was formed and right the way through this period. And from time to time, philosophical writers refer to individual teachers with whom they had had contact. In the case of Origen, he repeatedly refers to ideas of reincarnation and what he calls transmigration of souls in a way that suggests that he was well aware of both Hindu and Buddhist thinking in this regard. However, Origen himself applied this kind of analysis in an innovative way, and this will show you the adventurous nature of a great deal of his thinking. In a later period, people had said, oh, Origen taught reincarnation. He did not. What Origen did was engage in a thought experiment. This is the thought experiment. God is in the process of perfecting this world. He's making it better. And in the process of that, he assumes that we will live through the course of our lives and that history will unfold and that finally, at the end, God will be fully revealed. A good Platonist understanding. It's like Plato's myth of the cave. The idea is we are all slowly learning better and better until we can face reality. When we can face reality, that will be the true end of humanity. But what if the world wears out first? A very observant philosopher, Origen, said, you know, we're not really very quick at this. It's not unfolding with any rapidity. What if, you know, the material existence of the world is over before God has worked out his purposes? Simple. God simply makes another world, and transfers us to that world. Origen thought through the idea of a parallel universe before anyone was thinking about it. So you see the way in which probably he's been influenced by these ideas, but he's not simply taking them up. He's deploying their possibilities to enter speculative questions. Yes, please. Excellent question. What is going on in Judaism during this period? There is a massive reformulation caused by several factors. One of them is the truly important destruction of Jerusalem. We, when we're focused on the New Testament, talk about the destruction of Jerusalem in the year 70. But that was actually only a prelude to a much more disastrous event. When Jerusalem was besieged, taken, and burned again by the Romans in the year 135. And in that year, they actually flattened everything that was on top of the Temple Mount. They had horses pull off the masonry. You can find pieces of columns that belonged to the temple today underground in Jerusalem. And the Romans also stated that Jews were not permitted to live again in the Holy City. They wanted an end of any kind of revolution. The consequence of that was, although obviously any kind of national revolution had been wiped off the realm of possibility, the power of the rabbis increased. The rabbis increasingly took the point of view that an attempt to decide who the Messiah was and when the Messiah was coming was to be ruled out, and that their entire focus should be on the Torah. And the idea of the Torah as being an eternal law comes into its own precisely during the 2nd century. Under the Romans, with the Roman policy becoming more and more restrictive of Judaism, and then with the coming of Constantine, with emperors and Catholics referring to Jews as if they were heretics, there was a natural tendency for them to move out of the Holy Land and towards Persia, towards Babylonia. And that's why the Babylonian Talmud is the most important document of Rabbinic Judaism, because they made their way to Babylonia under the time of the Sassanids, relatively tolerant rulers who permitted Jews to live in their own communities so that they could frame their existence on the basis of a Torah they held to be eternal. And the consequence of that is that the Talmud became a fine-tuned attempt to make everything that a person does subject to the governance of the Torah. And they held that in their complete dedication to that, they would ultimately overcome any kind of obstacle, including the power of Rome. Yes, please, Michael.
When Constantine called the Council of Nicaea, having been raised by a Christian mother, did it matter to him what conclusions they came up with? Did he have a point of view? Did he have preference?
Yeah, this is a very interesting question. Did Constantine have a point of view at Nicaea? As you rightly say, his mother, Helena, had been the concubine of his father. She was a baptized Christian, brought him up. He knew what was there. And Constantine has attributed to him enormous theological interest by Eusebius, especially in Eusebius' praise of Constantine. I am reserved about the amount of theological sophistication that Constantine really had. during the 4th century, he sent Mom, Helena, to Jerusalem. And while Mom is in Jerusalem, there is discovered to her satisfaction the true cross and the nails that were used to affix Jesus to the cross. Constantine decides, I'm going to put these to the best use imaginable. So he melts them down, and one of them is used to reinforce his helmet, and the other goes into his horse's bridle. And his conception is, just like the troops would be protected at the Milvian Bridge by the insignia, so I will be protected when I am in battle. This is not a philosophical Platonist. And as a result of that, I am more than reserved, I am critical of views which imagine, namely James Carroll's view, that Constantine sat there at Nicaea saying, oh, this will go into the New Testament and that will go out of the New Testament. This never happened. I don't believe Constantine ever read a document of more than 5 pages. And he doesn't seem to have developed that kind of theological taste. I don't mean that he was unintelligent. It's just that he was doing something different. He was ruling an empire. He was also doing something extraordinarily difficult. He was trying to rule an empire using all the power of that empire and at the same time to accord with a gospel whose values are quite different. No surprise that he was only baptized at the end of his life, because he knew very well he would need to do things as emperor that would contradict his baptism. Yes, please.
Mysticism is my major interest. And earlier talk, and you were mentioning, Christ was supposed to have said, my Father's house has many mansions. And then in the Oriental tradition, there's the concept of many realms above the earth plane. You want to comment on that?
Sure, and thank you for quoting that translation. It is in the Gospel according to John, my Father's house has many mansions. It's not, my Father's house has many rooms. I mean, this thing is not a tenement, right? And in fact, you can see the kind of architectural imagery that's involved if you visit the city of Ephesus today. Ephesus is one of the best archaeological excavations there is, of acres that have been revealed of the ancient city. And fortunately, there's no modern city, so there's nothing to get in the way. And you can see there an actual vast complex inside which there are individual mansions, each with its own atrium, its own salon for philosophical discussion, its own kitchen, its own bedrooms, its own dining rooms. So you have a conception that there is an enormous complexity in the divine world, which also corresponds to Near Eastern mysticism, including Jewish mysticism, but not limited to that. And as you say, to other reconstructions of how vast the world beyond this one must be to account for why we are here. And there's a sense of that actually within the Creed, in its reference to all things invisible and visible. That is, however it is that you might account for that reality, the ultimate source of that reality needs to be understood as God as creator. And I just got the cut sign from the cardinal, and if I don't listen to the cut sign, he gives me another less pleasant sign. So I'll stop there and hope to see you next week.